Picture this, 1949, post-war America. Movie theaters packed with people desperate for stories that felt real, raw, unpolished. Your father might have been one of them, standing in line to see a boxing picture nobody expected to matter. The name on the marquee was unfamiliar, Kirk Douglas. Not yet the legend, not yet the icon. Just another contract player trying to break through. But when the lights dimmed and Midge Kelly appeared on screen, something shifted in American cinema. This wasn't the sanitized Hollywood version of struggle. This was rage incarnated, ambition weaponized, vulnerability turned to venom. Audiences walked out of theaters shaken. Critics scrambled to understand what they'd witnessed. And Kirk Douglas? He walked off that said a different man than the one who'd walked on. What happened during the filming of Champion wasn't just acting. It was excavation, a brutal unearthing of something Douglas himself hadn't known was buried inside. The performance earned him his first Oscar nomination. But the cost of that discovery, the man he became when he put on Midge Kelly's gloves, that would echo through every relationship, every set, every moment of his 103-year life. If you appreciate stories that reveal the hidden truths behind Hollywood's greatest legends, subscribe now. Because what you're about to discover about Kirk Douglas and Champion will change how you see every performance that came after. Before there was Kirk Douglas, there was Issur Danielovitch, a name that carried the weight of displacement, poverty, and impossible dreams. Born in December 1916 in Amsterdam, New York, to Russian Jewish immigrants who'd fled persecution only to find a different kind of struggle in America. His father, Herschel, was a ragman, collecting scraps to sell, barely keeping the family of 7 sisters and Issur alive. The boy grew up sharing a bed with his siblings, wearing clothes sewn from flour sacks, watching his mother Brenna work her fingers raw, trying to maintain dignity in a household where dignity was a luxury they couldn't afford. But Brenna had dreams for her only son, dreams that whispered of stages and spotlights, and a life far removed from the grinding poverty of their cold water tenement. Those words planted seeds that would eventually produce something remarkable, something powerful. Because the hunger that poverty creates doesn't just disappear when you escape it. It transforms, becomes part of your cellular structure. And for Issur Danielovitch, that hunger would become the engine that drove Kirk Douglas to heights of success that came with their own kind of cost. The transformation from Issur to Kirk wasn't just a name change. It was a reinvention born of necessity and ambition. He worked his way through St. Lawrence University, studying theater and discovering that on stage he could become anyone, anything, escaping the limitations of his birth. After graduation in 1939, he made his way to New York City with $40 in his pocket and a determination that frightened people who met him. The American Academy of Dramatic Arts accepted him, and there he honed a craft that would eventually make him one of Hollywood's most compelling actors. But even as he learned technique, something else was forming inside him, a drive that went beyond mere ambition, a need to prove himself that felt almost violent in its intensity. World War II interrupted his nascent career, but when he returned in 1945, he was ready to conquer Hollywood with a ferocity that the film industry had rarely seen. Champion came to Kirk Douglas through circumstances that would change everything. The script, adapted from a Ring Lardner short story, told the brutal tale of Midge Kelly, a boxer who claws his way from poverty to championship glory by betraying everyone who ever loved him. It was dark material, unflinching in its portrayal of ambition divorced from morality. Studios were hesitant. This wasn't the kind of hero Americans wanted to see. The production company, United Artists, was taking a gamble on director Mark Robson and an even bigger gamble on Kirk Douglas, who by 1948 hadn't yet found a role that would define him. Douglas read the script and felt something click into place. Midge Kelly was poor, desperate, angry at a world that had given him nothing. Midge Kelly was willing to do anything to escape the trap of poverty. And somewhere deep inside, Kirk Douglas recognized pieces of that character, pieces he'd been suppressing, keeping locked away behind the charming smile and the cleft chin that would become iconic. The preparation for Champion was intense. Douglas trained with professional boxers for weeks, learning not just how to throw punches, but how to move like someone who'd spent years in the ring. But the physical preparation was only part of what Douglas was doing. He was also excavating something psychological, reaching down into memories and feelings he'd spent years trying to bury. The poverty of his childhood, the shame of being different, the rage he'd felt watching his father humiliated, his mother exhausted, his family always on the edge of disaster. Douglas had spent years channeling that rage into ambition, into the engine that had carried him from Amsterdam, New York to Hollywood. But Midge Kelly required him to let that rage become visible, to stop sublimating it, and instead let it burn raw and unfiltered on screen. What Douglas discovered during those weeks of preparation was terrifying. He discovered that when he stopped controlling that rage, when he allowed himself to embody pure ambition without conscience, it felt good. It felt powerful. It felt like finally taking off a mask he'd been wearing his entire adult life. Filming began in late 1948, and from the first day on set, everyone knew they were witnessing something unusual. Mark Robson had worked with dark material before, but what Douglas brought to Midge Kelly went beyond what the script required. There was a rawness to his performance, an authenticity that made scenes uncomfortable to watch even for the crew filming them. In one sequence, Midge Kelly betrays his brother, using him as a stepping stone and then discarding him without remorse. Douglas played the scene with such casual cruelty that the actor playing his brother found it difficult to separate performance from reality. The scenes with women were particularly challenging. Midge Kelly uses women, manipulates them, takes what he needs, and moves on. Douglas played these moments not with obvious villainy, but with a kind of entitled assumption that made them even more disturbing. The boxing sequences became legendary. Douglas insisted on doing as many of his own stunts as safely possible, and the result was fight choreography that felt visceral and real. These weren't the clean, theatrical boxing matches of earlier Hollywood films. These were struggles for survival, and Douglas brought to them an intensity that made audiences flinch. But it was the quieter moments that revealed the true depth of what Douglas was achieving. Scenes where Midge Kelly sits alone, counting his money or staring at his reflection, showed a man who'd gained everything he thought he wanted and found it empty. The performance was doing something to Douglas himself, though. Cast members noticed that he was different between takes, more irritable, more demanding. It was as if playing Midge Kelly 8 hours a day was bleeding into who Kirk Douglas was during the other 16 hours. Champion premiered in April 1949, and the response was overwhelming. Critics who had been prepared to dismiss another boxing picture found themselves grappling with a performance that transcended the genre. The film became a substantial commercial success, and the Academy Awards recognized this with a nomination for Best Actor, Douglas's first of 3 career nominations. At 32 years old, Kirk Douglas had arrived. But the cost of that arrival was something he was only beginning to understand. In interviews following the film's release, Douglas would make statements that revealed his own confusion about what had happened during the making of Champion. He told reporters that playing Midge Kelly had been like opening a door he hadn't known existed. The most revealing moment came years later when Douglas was asked to reflect on Champion and what it had meant to his career. His response was brief but loaded with implications. He said, "I didn't think I was so tough until I did Champion, then I was a tough guy." The statement seems simple on the surface, almost like a joke about typecasting. But the weight of those words reveals something more profound. Douglas wasn't talking about being perceived as tough by audiences. He was talking about discovering toughness within himself, a capacity for hardness that he hadn't fully recognized before embodying Midge Kelly. The distinction matters enormously. An actor who plays tough characters is performing. An actor who discovers toughness through performance is transforming. And transformation, unlike performance, doesn't stop when the cameras stop rolling. What Douglas found in himself while playing Midge Kelly became part of his operational template for the rest of his career and, by many accounts, for his personal life as well. The drive that had carried him from poverty to Hollywood success acquired a harder edge after Champion. The ambition that had seemed admirable became more ruthless. The confidence that had been charming developed aspects of arrogance. The roles Douglas chose after Champion reflected this transformation. He gravitated toward characters who were complicated, morally ambiguous, driven by obsessions that isolated them from others. In Ace in the Hole, he played a journalist so consumed by ambition that he allows a man to die to extend a story. In The Bad and the Beautiful, he portrayed a producer who uses and discards people in his quest for cinematic greatness. In Lust for Life, his Van Gogh was brilliant but tormented. These weren't accidents of casting. Douglas was drawn to these roles because they allowed him to explore aspects of himself that Champion had revealed. Champion didn't just launch Kirk Douglas's career as a leading man. It fundamentally altered his understanding of himself and his capabilities. The performance taught him that he could access darkness, that he could portray cruelty convincingly, that somewhere inside the boy from Amsterdam, New York, who dreamed of escape, was a man capable of ruthlessness in pursuit of goals. This discovery shaped the next 7 decades of his life. It influenced how he negotiated contracts, how he chose projects, how he interacted with colleagues. It informed his decision to form his own production company, Brenna Productions, named after his mother, giving him control over his career in ways few actors of his era achieved. It drove him to take risks, like insisting on Dalton Trumbo as screenwriter for Spartacus during the Blacklist era, a decision that helped break Hollywood's shameful capitulation to McCarthyism. The irony is that Champion, the role that revealed Douglas's capacity for portraying moral compromise, also led indirectly to some of his most morally courageous career decisions. The confidence he gained from that breakthrough performance gave him the security to take stands that other actors wouldn't risk. When he hired Trumbo for Spartacus and insisted on crediting him, that required a kind of toughness that perhaps had its roots in the Midge Kelly discovery. When he survived a helicopter crash in 1991 that killed 2 others, and then a stroke in 1996 that stole his ability to speak clearly, and rebuilt himself both times, that required reserves of determination that might trace back to what he'd learned about himself in 1948. Kirk Douglas lived to be 103 years old, dying in February 2020 as one of the last living connections to Hollywood's golden age. In those final years, he had time to reflect on the arc of his career, the choices he'd made, the person he'd been. In Champion, his first real leading role, remained a touchstone, the performance that changed everything, the moment when he discovered capabilities within himself that were both blessing and burden. The toughness he found wasn't inherently negative. It gave him courage, determination, resilience. It helped him survive an industry that could be brutal to those who showed weakness. But like any powerful tool, it could be misused, could create distance when connection was needed. Douglas's long life gave him time to integrate this discovery, to learn when to deploy that toughness and when to set it aside. His later years were marked by philanthropy, by efforts to make amends where needed, by a softening that suggested wisdom hard-won. Champion remains a landmark in American cinema, a boxing picture that transcended its genre to say something true about ambition, poverty, and the American dream's dark underside. But it's also a landmark in Kirk Douglas's personal evolution, the role that taught him who he could be when he stopped editing himself. That intensity made him a star. It made him powerful. It made him, by his own admission, tough in ways he hadn't known he could be. What's certain is that Champion changed everything. The boy from Amsterdam, New York, who became Kirk Douglas, learned something about himself in 1948 that would resonate through every role, every relationship, every challenge for the next 72 years. The lights that dimmed in 1949 theaters revealed more than Midge Kelly on screen. They revealed Kirk Douglas to himself. And American cinema would never be quite the same